Ever get that feeling like you're just along for the ride when it comes to the forces shaping the world around us? Not just the daily news, but the deeper stuff you know.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into an idea that one of our listeners brought up in Coffee Talk, and honestly, it's pretty thought-provoking. It's the concept of America becoming, well, an oligarchy.
Right, right. I mean, coffee talk really gets to the heart of how power really works in America and asks, are we drifting towards a system where just a handful of super wealthy individuals are calling the shots, controlling our economy, our politics, even, the information we see and hear? So in this deep dive, we really want to unpack the main points from coffee talk and explore just how much weight this idea of oligarchy really holds.
Totally. Coffee Talk doesn't pull any punches, and it asks some pretty big questions like, is the U.S. really headed down this path towards oligarchy? And if so, what does that mean for our democracy?
Yeah, some really big questions.
All right, so let's jump right in. Coffee Talk kicks things off by looking at the role of money in American politics. And let's be honest, it's a pretty big role. What were your first impressions of that section?
I think what struck me immediately was how Coffee Talk argues that money isn't just like a background factor, it's front and center, a driving force in American politics. The piece suggests that politicians might end up prioritizing corporations and wealthy individuals just because, well, they're the ones who often bankroll their campaigns. It's like this constant need for funding puts a certain type of pressure on politicians.
Yeah, and the source brings up the Citizens United VFEC Supreme Court decision from back in 2010. For folks who might not remember all the details, why does this decision keep coming up in conversations about money and politics?
If we connect this whole idea of a potential oligarchy in America, the way Coffee Talk presents it, Citizens United is this really significant turning point. The ruling itself was specifically about these things called independent expenditures, which basically means spending on stuff like campaign ads or other activities that aren't directly controlled by the candidate's own campaign. But the key takeaway and what made this decision so controversial is that it allowed corporations and unions to spend unlimited amounts of money on these independent expenditures in elections. Now, how Coffee Talk interprets this is that it essentially opened the door for a situation where a few really rich individuals and these massive corporations could, in a way, drown out the voices of everyday citizens simply by spending a ton of money.
So it's not necessarily about straight up bribery, right? It's more about creating this environment where certain viewpoints get way more attention just because there's so much money pushing them. And Coffee Talk uses this term vicious loop to describe this whole dynamic. What exactly are they getting at there?
Well, I think they're highlighting a really important point about how this all works in practice. Coffee Talk basically argues that because running for office, especially for higher level positions, has become so expensive, candidates are almost forced to go to the people and organizations that can give them the most money, right? And naturally, the wealthiest donors are the ones with the deepest pockets. So the idea is that as a result, politicians might become way more tuned in to what these big donors want, what kind of policies they favor, and less in tune with what the average voter thinks. And this loop, as they call it, is made even stronger by the fact that campaign costs just keep going up, making candidates even more reliant on those big donors and, possibly more likely to listen to them when it comes to making policy decisions.
Right. It's like this cycle that's really hard to break out of. Okay, so moving on a bit, Coffee Talk also spends a good chunk of time talking about economic inequality, and they start with a pretty shocking statistic about wealth distribution.
Yeah, the one about how the richest 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. It's meant to make you stop and really think about just how unequal things are in the US right now. What's interesting is that looking back, there was a similar concentration of wealth during the Gilded Age, back in the late 1800s. So Coffee Talk is sort of raising the question, are we seeing history repeat itself? And what does that mean, not just for politics, but for society as a whole?
That's a great point, thinking about historical patterns. And then Coffee Talk contrasts that concentration of wealth with what's happening with average workers, wages staying pretty flat while CEO salaries and corporate profits keep going up. So what's the link the source is drawing between those trends?
Well, the way Coffee Talk explains it, it all comes down to this fundamental imbalance in how, the fruits of economic growth are actually distributed. So, yeah, the economy might be growing overall, but the benefits aren't reaching everyone equally. And Coffee Talk highlights things like tax policies and loopholes that seem to benefit the wealthiest and big corporations, allowing them to accumulate more and more wealth. But at the same time, the average worker isn't seeing much growth in their paycheck. And on top of that, they're dealing with the rising cost of housing, healthcare, education. So you have this situation where economic power keeps getting more and more concentrated at the top.
So it's not just about wealth existing, it's about how the whole system seems to be set up to funnel more wealth to the top, right? And then Coffee Talk gets into why it's so tough to actually change this dynamic.
Exactly. It's like, as Coffee Talk suggests, the people who benefit most from the way things are right now, they have a big incentive to keep things the same. So they might resist any policies that aim to make things more fair, to spread the wealth and power around a bit more. And the examples they give: progressive taxes, making healthcare more accessible, policies that support fair wages. These are all things that could potentially shift resources or influence, and Coffee Talk is suggesting that these are exactly the types of policies that might face a lot of pushback from the elite.
Yeah, it creates this sense of a system that just keeps reinforcing itself. Okay, so from there, Coffee Talk moves into talking about the possible consequences of this concentration of power. And it's not exactly a rosy picture.
No, not at all. And I think the most important point here is the connection Coffee Talk makes between this concentration of power in both economics and politics and a growing sense of powerlessness among everyday people. This feeling that your opinion, your vote, doesn't really matter. Coffee Talk links that directly to the outsized influence that billionaires and corporations seem to have, not just in politics and the economy, but also in shaping the information we get through, media ownership and influence.
And that erosion of trust, that people are losing faith in the system, that seems like a huge consequence that Coffee Talk really emphasizes.
Absolutely. Coffee Talk argues that when enough people feel like their voices aren't being heard and that the system is rigged in favor of the few, it just naturally leads to this decline in trust in the government, in the media, in institutions in general. And the piece suggests that this loss of trust can actually create the conditions for some pretty scary stuff: the rise of extremism, the spread of misinformation, more and more division and polarization within society. It's like weakening the foundation of a healthy democracy. It's definitely a sobering thought. But Coffee Talk does offer a little bit of hope, right? It suggests that people aren't completely powerless in this situation.
Yeah, and that's a really crucial part of the discussion in the source.
Well,
While acknowledging how serious this potential for oligarchy is, Coffee Talk stresses that, what individuals do can still make a difference. They point to specific things people can do, like actively supporting independent journalism so we have a wider range of viewpoints, getting involved in efforts to reform campaign finance laws so that big donors don't have so much sway, and advocating for policies that benefit a broader segment of the population. And Coffee Talk even poses the question to the reader of what specific impacts supporting independent journalism might have in terms of changing the narrative or, empowering different voices. And the answer they propose is that supporting independent journalism could mean that more diverse stories and perspectives get heard, which would hopefully counteract the dominance of narratives pushed by the very wealthy or, corporate-owned media outlets. So it's about actively pushing back against these forces that seem to be leading us towards oligarchy, right? And the main takeaway from Coffee Talk seems to be about being informed and engaged.
exactly. The source concludes by making it really clear that staying informed about these issues and getting involved in the democratic process are super important. The argument is that recognizing and understanding these potential oligarchic tendencies is the first step towards actually being able to challenge them and work towards a society that's more fair and representative. So knowledge in this context is power. It's a power that individuals can have.
So we come back to that core question that Coffee Talk posed at the beginning. Is the U.S. really sliding towards oligarchy, or is there still hope for a healthy democracy? It's a question that deserves a lot more thought and action, I'd say.
Absolutely. And thinking about how closely economic and political power are intertwined, which Coffee Talk makes so clear. It really makes you wonder, beyond voting and supporting certain organizations, what else can people do in their daily lives to make their voices heard, to
Yeah.
potentially shift the direction things are going? Because it's not just about who we vote for, it's also about how we engage with information, what businesses we choose to support, even the conversations we have in our communities.
And on that note, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.